All right, we're going to be looking today at the times of the Gentiles. So find your Bible if you have it with you. We'll look at Luke 21 to start, and then we'll get into the book of Daniel. There's a lot here to pack into an hour and a bit, and we'll just see how far we get into this today. But let me just start off by giving you some introductions about what the times of the Gentiles are. If you're in your Bible, Luke 21 is where we'll start, and I just want to read you a verse or two here. The Lord, of course, is speaking of some things here with relation to the coming destruction of Jerusalem, and he uses a phrase here in Luke 21, and look down with me at verse number 24. Speaking of those in Jerusalem, they shall fall by the edge of the sword, and shall be led away captive into all nations. And Jerusalem shall be trodden down of the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles be fulfilled. So that's where we get the expression, obviously, the times of the Gentiles. And so let me give you a bit of introduction and definitions to all of this here in the Bible. All right, so the times of the Gentiles, you know the word times in the book of Daniel, time, a dividing of times, speaking of years. So when Jesus is speaking of the times of the Gentiles, then we're talking about effectively what I said here. It's the power and decline of the Gentile nations over time in a span of years. So the time of the Gentiles refers to a period from the Babylonian captivity of Judah under Nebuchadnezzar. That was in roughly 606 BC until the second advent of the Lord Jesus Christ. And that's where Israel is going to become the head of the nations. If you were to go back into Deuteronomy chapter 28, the Lord talked about that to Israel. Verse number 13, he said that there's going to come a time where he said the Lord will make thee the head and not the tail. So the Lord is referring here to this period of time. It is a definite marked period of time, which we're going to look at here together today. This is really where the scepter of earthly power is transferred from Israel to the Gentile nations for a season. This was defined in Luke 21. In this Olivet discourse the Lord had, and he's talking about the destruction by Titus that's coming to Jerusalem, but effectively talking about a further span of time than simply just that. So this is what the times of the Gentiles is. Now let me just give you this. This began when Nebuchadnezzar conquered Jerusalem, and Hosea foretold about this. I've given you that reference here. Hosea talked about this. For the children of Israel shall abide many days without a king, and without a prince, and without a sacrifice, and without an image, and without an ephod, and without a teraphim. And afterward shall the children of Israel return and seek the Lord their God, and David their king, and shall fear the Lord and his goodness in the latter days. So this time began at Nebuchadnezzar and his capture in the 600s BC, and it is not named in the book of Daniel, which we're going to go to here in just a moment, but it's described in the book of Daniel. So really the whole book of Daniel essentially is outlining what the times of the Gentiles would be in the future. And so although you don't see that expression, the times of the Gentiles, in the book of Daniel, it's described there, particularly from chapter 5 and onward. So let's look at Daniel chapter 2 then, and we're going to stay here in the Old Testament book for our time together. We were praying this morning for those that came into that time. And one of the things that Brother Steve said, and I echo that, I think it was a good point, is the purpose of our learning together is not just that we'd be filled with knowledge. Knowledge is good. It's important that we understand it. But it's a knowledge that will help us to become better in our understanding of world events and how they relate to what God said. But the ultimate purpose is to be able to preach the gospel with a result of what we know. If anything should stir us up, it's these 2 or 3 days together, because it helps us to see, obviously, not only is the Bible true, which is just a reinforcement of what we already believe, but what it does is it ought to stir us up to share Christ with a world that's destined for eternal judgment. And so really that's the desire, I think, of all of our hearts at Herald of Hope, is that as we study this together, it would empower us to preach to the lost. All right, Daniel chapter 2. So let's talk about this a little bit here about the times of the Gentiles and what we see in the book of Daniel in chapter 2. All right, so you'd be familiar here. Daniel is in captivity. The king has a dream. Daniel is now brought in effectively to interpret this dream. I'm obviously skipping over some pertinent details here, but in Daniel chapter 2, what we find here is God is going to share what's going to pass in the end times. So let's look in Daniel chapter number 2. The king has the dream. Daniel eventually gets the interpretation from the Lord in a night vision, and he comes back into the king. And let's look at verse number 29, if you'll look at it there in that book. As for thee, Daniel says, O king, thy thoughts came into thy mind upon thy bed, what should come to pass hereafter, and he that revealeth secrets maketh known to thee what shall come to pass. So we talk about when will these things be. The king had this dream, which we'll look at in depth here in just a moment. But the king had a dream about all of this, and Daniel says here, according to the Lord's revelation in Daniel, he that revealeth secrets, speaking of God, he's making known to you, king, what shall come to pass, something that's in the future. So we're asking the question, well, when will these things be? When we think about the times of the Gentiles, what the book of Daniel talks about and defines for us, we've got to ask the question, well, when will this come to pass? Now, when we study particularly Daniel 2, but chapter 7 as well, what you're going to find here is this is going to distinguish whether you are a postmillennial, an amillennial, or a premillennial person. All right, you're going to fall into one of those three categories in your study of Daniel chapter number 2. In other words, the question is this: well, when does the kingdom come? That's really the question. So let's just look at it just very briefly. Right, you see that the postmillennial side here, if you are a postmillennialist, you believe that Christ comes to reign on this earth after Christians have already brought in peace and prosperity into this world. Righteousness is already in the world, and then Jesus basically comes and takes over because we did all the work. So that's essentially a postmillennial view. Then you have an amillennial view. And that view is this, that there is no 1,000-year period of time where Jesus Christ comes back and reigns upon the earth. All of that is symbolic. The amillennial view would hold that. So they're essentially saying Christ spiritually reigns on the hearts of his people. There is no 1,000-year reign. And then you have the premillennial view, which believes that Jesus Christ returns to this earth before that 1,000-year period of time. And of course, Brother Peter's going to give a study on that 1,000-year reign and all of that to us at a later time. So all of that is really encompassed in, or your understanding of future events is all really going to be defined in one of those three positions, and you're going to get that with your understanding or interpretation of Daniel chapter 2. So let's look at it together so we can understand what the dreams meant and then how you and I are supposed to fall in line with that and what we're supposed to believe about future events. All right? So let's talk about the two dreams that we see here. Let's read continually here in Daniel chapter 2 from where we were in verse number 29. So he said that God had revealed this at the end of verse number 29 to make known to thee what shall come to pass. But as for me, this secret is not revealed to me for any wisdom that I have more than any living, but for their sakes that shall make known the interpretation to the king, and that thou mightest know the thoughts of thine heart. Now here's the dream. Thou, O king, sawest, and behold a great image. This great image, whose brightness was excellent, stood before thee, and the form thereof was terrible. This image's head was of fine gold, his breast and his arms of silver, his belly and his thighs of brass, his legs of iron, his feet part of iron and part of clay. Thou sawest till that a stone was cut out without hands, which smote the image upon the feet that were of iron and clay, and brake them to pieces. Then was the iron, the clay, the brass, the silver, and the gold broken to pieces together, and and became like the chaff of the summer threshing floors. And the wind carried them away, that no place was found for them. And the stone that smote the image became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. All right, this is the dream, Daniel said in verse number 36. So you can imagine the king has no idea what this is and couldn't even remember the dream. Daniel had to tell him what it was and then gave him the interpretation of it. So these two dreams, there's one here that the king has, chapter 7. There's another dream or a vision that Daniel has. And then we'll look at both of those things together now. But this is really a framework. These dreams are a framework for the times of the Gentiles. And so note something about this. What Daniel interpreted with Nebuchadnezzar, and then what Daniel saw in his own dream in chapter 7 was prophecy to him. It was future to him. But for you and I, most of it is history. Not all of it. So Daniel saw prophecy. We're looking back at history for the most part. Okay, there's obviously a big chunk that's not history. It's still future to you and I today. So let's break this down into the two dreams, and we're going to start with the pagan. The pagan is the king himself, right? At this point, an unbeliever. And so we read these verses of the dream, but let's talk about what the interpretation is that God gives to Daniel. So look at verse 31. Thou, O king, sawest, and behold a great image. This great image, whose brightness was excellent, stood before thee, and the form thereof was terrible. This image's head was of fine gold, his breast and his arms of silver, his belly and thighs of brass, his legs of iron, his feet of part of iron and clay. And then he talked about the fact that it was all broken up. Verse 36, this is the dream. And we will tell the interpretation thereof before the king. Thou, O king, art a king of kings. For the God of heaven hath given to thee a kingdom, power, strength, and glory. And wheresoever the children of men dwell, the beasts of the field and the fowls of heaven hath he given into thine hand, and hath made thee ruler over them all. Thou art this head of gold. So this begins now an understanding of what this image is and the different parts of the image itself. And after thee shall arise another kingdom inferior to thee, and another third kingdom of brass, and shall bear rule over all the earth. And the fourth kingdom shall be strong as iron, forasmuch as iron breaketh in pieces and subdueth all things. And the iron that breaketh all things, and as iron that breaketh all things, shall it break in pieces and bruise. So this image that Nebuchadnezzar saw here, it represented four major kingdoms of the world that were to come. These four kingdoms, there were more than four kingdoms in the world, but these four major kingdoms were worldwide empires that would rise and fall during this period of time, the times of the Gentiles. Flip over to chapter 7 very quickly, if you would. Chapter 7. And I just want you to notice in parallel, we'll go right back to chapter 2, but look at verse 17. These great beasts, and again, I'll explain that to you in a moment, which are four kings which shall arise out of all the earth. All right, so go back to chapter 2. So in the vision that Nebuchadnezzar has, he sees the image represented by different metals. Daniel's vision is something entirely different, but it's the same thing, just seen from a different perspective. And these are the empires that were going to rise and fall during this time of the Gentiles. All right, so when we look at this image here that Nebuchadnezzar had, this is the image of a man from the top down. And so he gives this image from the top down, and it represents a deterioration of the world from the time of Nebuchadnezzar to the end of the time of the Gentiles until the coming of the King of Kings. So it's a view from the top down. The description is given from the head to the feet, and it's a representation here of the deterioration of man. All right, obviously what you know with men and with kingdoms is that it follows the law of entropy, doesn't it? Everything tends toward disorder. And so that's true in life, in nature, in kingdoms, in the world. That's the process of sin in this world. And so that's what you see represented here by this image. Now, keep in mind, Nebuchadnezzar is the one who had this dream. So what God's going to give us here is a perspective of the four coming kingdoms through the eyes of men. And so what you see here, of course, is the empires of the world are all displayed in splendor, in glory, in wealth, right? Because the image here is of precious metal. At least that's how it starts. And so Nebuchadnezzar is viewing the kingdoms of the world this way. And all of the kingdoms of the world are personified here in wealth and in splendor, all right? The wealth of man. Now, the contrast in the vision here is, if you remember what we read in chapter 2, the stone that comes and breaks the image in pieces, we know that, of course, to be the return of Jesus Christ and the setting up of his kingdom. So what you see from the eyes of man are the kingdoms of the world are represented by wealth and splendor, and the kingdom of God is represented by a common stone. And so what you see is the perspective of men toward God and spiritual things. Man views God, if he has any regard for God at all, as something common and ordinary and unremarkable. But man's view of himself is personified in wealth and opulence and treasure. That's how man views himself. It's just the arrogance and pride of man, right? So that's what you see in this image. So what you also have with this image is you have different types of metals. So we have gold at the head, we have silver in the middle part, you have brass, and then you have iron, and then at the bottom, iron and clay. So what you have here with the metals in this image, they are decreasing in value but increasing in strength. All right? So they decrease in value from gold to iron or iron and clay, but they also increase in strength. Gold is a very malleable metal. You get down to iron, and iron is what it is. So let's look now at the image itself, and let's talk about what this represented in the kingdoms of the world. Again, now you and I are looking back at history. All of this was future to Daniel, but all these years later, we're looking back at it here. All right, so the head of gold, this was, of course, Babylon. What did Daniel say? Thou art this head of gold, right? He just said that in chapter number 2. So we know, of course, that Babylon itself was this head of gold. The rule effectively here was from 605 to 539 BC, if I've put that up there. And it lasted about 70 years, the empire here. This was the mightiest empire, the richest of world empires, and it marked the beginning of the times of the Gentiles. I would encourage you to read Clarence Larkin's book of Daniel. Only, not because there's some great stuff in it, which there is, but he records just a snippet of the history of the city of Babylon and the description of the city of Babylon from ancient writings. It's the most amazing thing to read when you see the opulence of this city back in this time. It was amazing. There's nothing like it. There's no kingdom that's ever been like it. And so God represents it here as this head of gold. Of course, this marked the beginning of the times of the Gentiles. Now, this was overthrown by Darius the Mede, which we'll look at here as well. And do you remember when Darius came in and conquered the city? This took place during the feast of Belshazzar, right, in Daniel in chapter number 5. So that was the overthrow of this head of gold. So what Daniel's doing is he's just simply delineating to the king, there are 4 empires. The image represents the world empires of the Gentiles. Something's coming at the end of it, which is going to cause the end of this particular times of the Gentiles, but it starts with you, all right? And so we have the head of gold. Then we saw secondly here, in chapter number 2, we saw the second part of it, that verse number 39, there shall arise another kingdom inferior to thee. And that's the only statement that he makes here, a kingdom inferior to thee. Now, we'll look at this again in more depth in chapter number 7, but this is the breast and the arms of silver. This was represented by the Medo-Persian Empire. So this was about 539 from the overthrow of Babylon to about 331 BC. And by the way, this is the ram of chapter 8, in Daniel chapter 8. This is the same one here. So what Daniel 8 does, by the way, is it focuses on the second and third kingdoms here of this vision, which is going to be the Medo-Persian Empire and the Greek Empire. But here, the breast and arms of silver, this is the Medo-Persian Empire. It was inferior in might. Again, Daniel said this in verse number 39. After thee shall arise another kingdom inferior to thee. So it was inferior in might. That empire lasted about 205 years. There were dual arms because you're looking at that part of the image that had 2 arms. And that was the coalition of the Medes and the Persians, represented by the 2 arms here. And the Medo-Persian Empire was overthrown by Alexander the Great. Again, going back to history, for a lot of us, that was a long time ago. And, you know, look, if you went to public school like I did, I didn't learn any of this in public school. But you have to study yourself to get a bit of this later. All right, so that was the second part of the image here, this torso of silver, the Medo-Persian Empire. Then we move down to the third part here, and this is the belly and thighs of brass. And again, if you're looking in chapter 2, verse number 39, and another third kingdom of brass, which shall bear rule over all the earth. So this was the Greek Empire from about 331 to 63 BC. And there's a little bit of ambiguity on the Greek Empire, which I'll explain to you in a moment. But around 63 BC, That was when the Roman general Pompey conquered Jerusalem. But what we find here is in Alexander's rule here, he was a conqueror, a rapid conqueror. And so his conquests are confirmed historically. You can look it up. Arrian, Plutarch, all of them wrote about this. He had an even greater territory than the Medo-Persian or the Babylonian Empire. If you look in verse number 39, he talks about the fact that he's going to bear rule over all the earth. And so Alexander was swift in his conquest and took a lot of territory. After his death, by the way, there were 4 generals that he had, and they ruled his empire until around 146 BC, when Greece was formally annexed into the Roman province of Achaia. That effectively ended the Greek Empire, or their political independence anyway. And so again, I don't think there's a hard line as to where the Greek and the Roman Empire transitioned, but it was somewhere around that time. So Daniel outlines here this third kingdom of brass. And then he talks about the legs and the feet of iron. If you notice in verse number 40, the fourth kingdom shall be as strong as iron. For as much as iron breaketh in pieces and subdueth all things. So we see its superiority, its dominance over the 3 prior kingdoms. And as iron that breaketh all things shall it break in pieces and bruise. All right, so this now is the Roman Empire. Again, somewhere around 63 BC until effectively the 400s, 476 or so AD. So the Roman Empire, as we know, was in place at the time of Christ. And there were undoubtedly several reasons that the Lord had for that. We know, of course, that it was in place and it advanced the gospel into Asia Minor, right? The system of government, the system of highways, all of those things facilitated the spread of the gospel north and west. But this empire was in place when Jesus was here. But the empire has changed in its form since that time, as we know, but it will still be in place at the time of the Second Advent, which we'll look at here in just a moment, the Roman Empire. So in 364, historically, 364 AD, the empire was divided for a time into a western and an eastern division. So we had the capital of Rome on the western side, we had Constantinople on the eastern side, and that was called the Byzantine Empire, if you're familiar with that, on the east. And those are the 2 legs of iron. So you have the division of the Roman Empire in those 2 legs. So we have the overthrow, or I guess I should say the reign of imperial Rome ended at the overthrow of Romulus Augustus, and that's when the imperial Rome ended in 476. It lasted about 505 years. But the Byzantine Empire continued on for a season, and it's considered a continuation of the Roman Empire in the east, and it lasted until the fall of Constantinople, and that was in 1453. So that 1453 was the end, if you will, of the Roman Empire in its entirety. But we need to understand that Papal Rome had formed already in the background and was very much in play and would continue to influence the world as it does right now, and will continue to do until the latter times. And of course, we'll look at that. So when we have Nebuchadnezzar's vision, he didn't even know what this was, and Daniel revealed this to him. This is what you saw, and this is what this means. So we have 4 dominant empires, Gentile empires, that were given to us in Daniel chapter 2. All right, so let's move into chapter 7 then, because we have a second vision. And this was no longer a vision from the pagan, but this is now a vision of the prophet Daniel himself. And so what we're going to see here is we're going to see the same thing. We're going to see some additions to it, some further information, but we're going to see it from a very different perspective. Remember, we were looking at the 4 empires from the perspective of men, and men would deify himself and glorify himself, which is why you see it illustrated that way. Verse 3, they were diverse one from another. We're in Daniel 7 and verse 4. The first was like a lion and had eagle's wings. I beheld till the wings thereof were plucked, and it was lifted up from the earth and made stand upon the feet as a man, and a man's heart was given to it. And behold, another beast, a second, like to a bear. And it raised up itself on one side, and it had 3 ribs in the mouth of it, between the teeth of it. And they said thus unto it, Arise, devour much flesh. After this I beheld, and lo, another, like a leopard, which had upon the back of it 4 wings of a fowl. The beast had also 4 heads, and dominion was given to it. After this I saw in the night visions, and behold, a 4th beast, dreadful and terrible and strong exceedingly. And it had great iron teeth. It devoured and brake in pieces, and stamped the residue with the feet of it. And it was diverse from all the beasts that were before it, and it had 10 horns. I considered the horns, and behold, there came up another among them, another little horn, before whom there were 3 of the first horns plucked up by the roots. And behold, in this horn were eyes like the eyes of man, and a mouth speaking great things. All right, so we'll come back to this and finish a little bit later on it. But let's go back to what the vision meant then. So that was what the vision was, and Daniel was troubled, and he was asking the Lord to give him some perspective on what this was. So in this sequence of events, what we see here now is it's not a pagan king, but it's the prophet of God who God said here was a man greatly beloved. Right? Daniel was a man greatly beloved. So the Lord is going to give him further information on these times of the Gentiles, represented, of course, by this vision here. The difference here is that Daniel doesn't see precious metals. Daniel sees savage beasts. Same kingdoms, entirely different perspective. All right? And this is the perspective between man and God. Man sees himself, obviously, in splendor, but God sees man and the kingdoms of man as savage beasts which have to be brought under the dominion of the Ancient of Days. That's the whole point. And so that's the perspective that we're having here, the difference between these two visions. Again, I want you to notice there's a degeneration. So just like it was with the image, you've got a degeneration of metals. And so it is here with these beasts. We see a degeneration, not of metals, but of animals. They go from this stately lion, the strongest of beasts, down to this, whatever it is, this generic savage animal that has no identity. It's just called a terrible beast or a dreadful beast. So it's a degeneration. And again, that's not a surprise knowing the New Testament and what the Lord had to say about it. So God is showing Daniel things here that he didn't show a wicked king. Right? He didn't show Nebuchadnezzar this, but he's going to show Daniel this. So let's look at the same kingdoms, but let's see them from the perspective here of the Lord. All right, so first of all, we're in chapter number 7. And if you go back to verse number 4, we see here the lion with eagle's wings, verse number 4. So, of course, we already know that this is speaking of Babylon, right? The empire, the kingdom of Babylon here. And we see now that it's a lion that has eagle's wings. Its strength in the lion, its swiftness of its conquest in the eagle's wings, as opposed to the wealth of the head of gold. Here we see something else given, the strength and the conquest of this empire. The wings, of course, can be seen as a reference to his flight. I should probably get to this. My apologies. His flight, his dominance above the kingdoms of the world and the nations as a ruler. The eagle's wings are a symbol of majesty. And of course, we see that in the majesty of Nebuchadnezzar. The arrogance that he had is not this great Babylon which I've built. Right? So that's the wings of the eagle. But God says here that the wings were plucked. Now, it depends on how you want to view that. There is no definitive way of knowing what that means. It could very well be that it's talking about the fact that Nebuchadnezzar was humbled because of his arrogance, and he was driven to be one of the beasts of the field for those years. I mean, it could very well be that that's what that is, but God does not clearly specify that that's what that means. So it might be. It could be his change after his madness, okay? Nevertheless, it says that his wings were plucked, and then he changed his form to walk like a man. He's still a beast. He just walks like a man. And of course, we see that historically, there was a difference in Nebuchadnezzar's rule in the latter end of his kingdom. And he used his intellect as opposed to his force. He had the administration of a kingdom in the latter years, whereas in the earlier years, it was the conquest. Nevertheless, that's what the lion with the eagle's wings is. And the Lord has given us that as far as a vision of this beast. All right, so this is the lion with the eagle's wings. Verse number 5, then, it says, another beast, the second, like to a bear. And then it was raised up on one side. It had 3 ribs in the mouth. So now we have a bear in verse number 5. And of course, we already know, what's the empire here? I already gave it to you. The Medo-Persian Empire. All right, so this correlates to the torso of silver in chapter number 2. Now, it was raised up or stronger on one side. And this would be a reference to the superiority of the Persian Empire over the Median Empire. Even though they were combined together, the Persian was the stronger of the two in that union. The ribs would indicate the conquest of territories. Now, again, there is no absolute way to define what this was. We can extrapolate from history what those things were, so let me give you what I think it was. There were three major kingdoms of Assyria and Babylon and Egypt that tried to check the Medo-Persian Empire, but they failed. And that could be the three ribs that are defined here. But we don't know specifically what that is. And then, of course, we see that the bear, if you're looking in verse number 5, it had three ribs in the mouth of it, between the teeth of it. And they said thus unto it, arise and devour much flesh. So that's exactly what the Medo-Persian Empire did. Now the bear from just the standpoint of an animal, it's inferior to the lion in its magnificence, but it's not necessarily inferior in its power. And so we see that there is power. It's inferior in its as a kingdom to Babylon. It didn't have the glory and the might of Babylon in that way, the splendor of it, but it was still a powerful nation, which we know historically the Medo-Persian Empire was. All right, so then let's keep going here. In verse number 6, after this I beheld, and lo, another, like a leopard, which had upon the back of it 4 wings of a fowl. The beast had also 4 heads, and dominion was given to it. Now you can imagine, this isn't going to make any sense to Daniel. He sees this, but he has no context for this. The privilege that we have here is to see some context, thank you, to see some context from history. We can go back and look at this. So what we see, this leopard with the 4 wings and the heads, is speaking, of course, we know of the Greek Empire. We already saw that in chapter 2. So this correlates to the belly, the abdomen of brass. And this is the agility of the Greek Empire. Here it's given as a leopard, speaking of its, not just its conquest, but its speed, right, with 4 wings. So this was under Alexander, and the 4 wings of a fowl that he had, and it was swift as an empire in conquest. It rapidly conquered the known world at that time. It was not as glorious. These are just 4 wings of a fowl. And the Greek Empire was not as glorious as the Babylonian Empire, the majesty of Babylon. But nevertheless, there's a swiftness to its conquest, which is given to us here. Now, the 4 heads represent the 4 divisions of the Greek Empire. Alexander died at a fairly young age. And so the kingdom was divided up into his 4 generals. At the time of his death, I don't think I've given you those there, but Macedonia was ruled by Cassander, Asia Minor by Lysicamus, Syria by Seleucus, which is the king of the north, and then Egypt by Ptolemy, the king of the south. So those 4 generals took the kingdom of Greece and ruled it for a period of time, until it transitioned into the Roman Empire. All right, so the leopard with 4 wings, and then the 4 heads. So the wings are the swiftness of its conquest. The heads are these 4 generals that ruled the empire after Alexander's death. All right, back to chapter 7 then. And then we see this dreadful and terrible beast. Look at verse number 7. After this, I saw in the night visions, and behold, a 4th beast, dreadful and terrible, and strong exceedingly. And it had great iron teeth. It devoured and brake in pieces, and stamped the residue with the feet of it. And it was diverse from all the beasts that were before it, and it had 10 horns. So let's look at this dreadful and terrible beast. Now, Daniel says this was unlike any beast. It was diverse, if you're looking at that in verse number 7. Diverse, different from all the beasts that were before it. So it was different than the other kingdoms. It had iron teeth. And of course, we know this to be the Roman Empire. It was a strong and brutal empire. Among the many other things, crucifixion and other things that Rome was known for. It was a strong and a brutal empire. But Daniel sees something unusual here, doesn't he? He sees a little horn that springs up amongst the 10 horns. And this didn't correspond with anything that he saw in Nebuchadnezzar's vision of the image with the 10 toes. So this didn't correspond. So God is showing Daniel something through his vision, something new that he did not show Nebuchadnezzar, the pagan king. So this was obviously future to Daniel, but most of it now is past to us, except for the division of the Roman Empire into the 10 toes, which which is going to be coming. All right, so this is the vision now between the image of Nebuchadnezzar and the beasts of Daniel. Both of those are found in the book of Daniel. So let's talk about the unfulfilled part of this prophecy. Because there are some things left in these times of the Gentiles, things that have not yet been fulfilled. Of course, we know, don't we? We're not bringing in the kingdom. We understand that. All you have to do is turn on any news channel at any point of the day, right? And we're not getting better and better, right? So there are some things that are unfulfilled in the vision that Daniel saw and the vision that Nebuchadnezzar saw. And of course, we know scripturally that's true. So what we see here is that Daniel saw prophecy, as I said, but we look back at history for the most part. So what we're going to do right now is we're going to look now ahead prophetically, and we're going to note that some of this is still in the future. So we know that the church age was a mystery. Paul said that in Ephesians chapter 3, first 9 verses of Ephesians 3. It was a mystery. And it stands in the middle of that mystery, that age in which we're living now, stands in the middle of the evolving of this fourth Gentile kingdom of Rome. We're right in the middle of it. The Roman Empire was never fully conquered. The conquest is not finished yet. It just changed its form. It continues on, as we know that to be true. So we have a description of, in Daniel 2, the 10 toes, and then we see the 10 horns in chapter number 7. And that's the final phase of the Gentile kingdoms before the return of Jesus Christ. And so where we are today is we're somewhere in the latter end of these times of the Gentiles, and this is unfolding in front of us right now. Now, I remember years ago, the old time experts in prophecy back in the 80s and early 90s talking about certain things with absolute certainty. And then those things have kind of faded away and changed in their form, and they weren't absolutely certain because they didn't actually happen. And I think when we think about unfulfilled prophecy, we just have to understand that we have the Bible and we have some things that are given to us, but only God sees the whole picture. Right? And so although we see things evolving in front of us right now by way of nations and kingdoms, we don't see the final form yet. It's on its way, it's progressing, but we don't see the final form yet. So just keep that in mind. So we're going to look ahead now and just see what this is. So let's talk about these 10 toes. All right, this is in Daniel chapter 2 again. So go back to that chapter and let's look at what's ahead. Verse number 41, he speaks to the king about this. He says, "And whereas thou sawest the feet and toes, part of potter's clay and part of iron, the kingdom shall be divided, but there shall be in it of the strength of the iron, for as much as thou sawest the iron mixed with miry clay. And as the toes of the feet were part of iron and part of clay, so the kingdom shall be partly strong and partly broken." Now, these toes that we see here, these 2 feet of Nebuchadnezzar, I mean, each foot has 5 toes. So we're talking about a total of 10 here. They've not yet been fully revealed yet, at least not in their final form. And what these 10 toes are in reference to is a final confederation of 10 kings or kingdoms. This was going to take place here at the very end before the Lord comes back. So these are 10 nations or rulers, kings, that are represented by the 10 toes. So we know that the Roman Empire, it no longer exists as Imperial Rome. We all know that. But the structure and laws of Rome still very much exist in our world today. Much of our law in Western society is based on Roman law. So we know some of that still exists today in the developed world. And when the Roman Empire is revived in fulfillment of Daniel's prophecy here, it will consist of 10 kingdoms, which are represented by these toes here in the image. Now we know that the toes are said here to be partly of iron and partly of clay. Again, if you've read students of prophecy, you will hear all sorts of things about this. Have you read any things about this? And it's difficult to know exactly what this is. So let me just give you some perspective. And you're welcome, of course, to try to figure out what you think God means by this. We know, of course, that there's strength in iron, there's weakness in clay, right? So the indication here is that in these kingdoms, there will be strength, but it'll be partly strong and partly weak in its unity and instability, despite the attempted unity of these kingdoms. We know that iron and clay, they mingle, but they're not cohesive. They can't join to one another. We know that to be true. So the indication is maybe that this federation of kings becomes more unstable over time. There are those that would talk about, go back to Genesis 6 and talk about that in relation to the Nephilim and, demonic interbreeding in the rise of giants. And I'm not necessarily opposed to that in the Bible. I think there's some credit to that. But that's not the study that we're looking at here today. Nevertheless, it's going to be a kingdom at the end that's going to have strength and weakness together here, and that's going to be the point here. We know that those kings are going to give themselves to the Antichrist and surrender their power to the Antichrist at some point. We know that's going to take place, and it could be in part because of the instability of the Confederation. We know that, of course, this is going to be under Rome, the revived Roman Empire. And so it's important to understand that this is not geographic as much as it is political and economic. The Roman Empire is. And religious, I guess that's probably the biggest one as well. All right, so these are the 10 toes, but we also see a correlation of that in the 10 horns in chapter 7. So turn over to chapter 7. And guys, as you're turning over there, I realize in a study like this, there's a whole lot we can't go through in 1 hour. There's a whole lot here. So the purpose of this is not to dive into every verse and everything, but to give you a general overview of this as we consider what these times are, the times of the Gentiles, and all of what they contain. So look at the 10 horns, Daniel 7, verse number 24. It says, the 10 horns out of this kingdom are 10 kings that shall arise, and then another shall arise after them. So what we see is that this fourth beast rises up as a ferocious beast, dreadful and terrible, Daniel says in his description. And out of this beast arise 10 powers that will come from the Roman Empire, this last of the 4 empires in the times of the Gentiles. So 10 kings will arise from this, and these are explicitly stated in chapter 7, verse 24, as being 10 kings that arise. So now there's a lot of speculation about what these 10 kings are. I remember years ago hearing about it, and this is the European Union. Okay, well, maybe, but not in its current form. I mean, there's 27 member states in the European Union right now. That's not 10. So maybe at some point it will form into this. It seems likely that it will, or some variation of that will. But at the moment, this is not clearly defined for us. So there's some speculation. So all we know is that they haven't been fully formed, these 10 kings, maybe in part, but they're not in their final form prior to the rapture. So just keep that in mind. So we have these 10 horns that arise out of the revived Roman Empire. We see the emergence in chapter 7 of this little horn. We see Daniel saw that in verse number 8. He saw this little horn that rose, and this really caught Daniel's attention, before whom there were 3 of the first horns plucked up by the roots, and then this horn had some things about him that God talks about here. So we know this emergence of the little horn. So it uproots 3 of the kings, this other king will. And of course, this being the Antichrist who will come to power. And in Revelation chapter 13 and 17, he displaces those 10 kings and rises to power here. So he overcomes 3 of the 10 kings. And then it says in chapter 7 here, verse number 25, speaking of him, that he shall speak great words against the Most High and shall wear out the saints of the Most High and think to change times and laws. And they shall be given into his hand until a time and times and dividing of time. Of course, you know that to be that 3.5 year period of time. All right, so this is the emergence of the little horn. Now, let's look at the smiting stone that shows up in both of these chapters. In chapter 7, if you'll look at verse number 13, since you're already there, he said, I saw in the night visions, and behold, one like the Son of Man came with the clouds of heaven, and came to the Ancient of Days, and they brought him near before him. And there was given him dominion and glory and a kingdom, that all people, nations, and languages should serve him. And his dominion is an everlasting dominion, which shall not pass away, and his kingdom that which shall not be destroyed. Go back to chapter 2. Chapter 2, the companion of that is in chapter 2, verse 44, 45. And in the days of these kings shall the God of heaven set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed, and the kingdoms shall not be left to other people, but it shall break in pieces and consume all these kingdoms, and it shall stand forever. For as much as thou sawest that the stone was cut out of the mountain without hands, and that it brake in pieces the iron, brass, clay, and silver, and the gold, the great God hath made known to the king what shall come to pass hereafter, and the dream is certain, and the interpretation thereof sure. So this smiting stone that Nebuchadnezzar saw, Daniel had a further clarification of that in his vision in chapter number 7. It destroys the image. Now, the image of Nebuchadnezzar, those four kingdoms, we notice that this stone overthrows the image in one cataclysmic event. It's not by measures or decrees, but the stone comes and destroys the entire image. And it indicates the savage judgment that's going to take place here, inflicted upon the kingdom of the Antichrist. And all of this happens in chapter 2 in the days of these kings, these last kings, speaking of those 10 kings represented by the 10 toes. This is speaking of the second advent of the Lord Jesus Christ, of which the Bible, this is probably the predominant theme in the Bible, the second advent. It's just over and over and over from start to finish about the judgment of God that's coming upon a wicked world. And so here to Nebuchadnezzar, God is showing him this thing. So the second advent of Christ. Of course, we know this in Revelation chapter number 19, that the Lord Jesus Christ comes back as King of Kings and Lord of Lords in fulfillment of Genesis 49 and verse number 24, the stone of Israel, right? All of this is prophetically tied through the Bible here. The stone comes back, destroys the kingdom of the Antichrist, the kingdoms of men, and the times of the Gentiles cease, and the Lord himself sets up the kingdom. Now, we're not going to look today, because I didn't actually put any slides together, but I can if we have a little bit of time here, at the difference between Daniel's beasts and John's beast in the book of Revelation. But we'll see if we have some time we can get into that. All right, let's move on to this little horn just a little bit. Now, I could have really gotten off into the weeds in this because there's a whole lot in the Bible about the Antichrist. But I didn't want to spend too much time on that before we're done here today. So if you're in chapter number 7, let's again read a few things about the Antichrist and see what the Lord said. We'll go back to verse number 20 and read these passages. It says, and of the 10 horns that were in his head, and of the other which came up, and before whom the 3 fell, even of that horn that had eyes, and a mouth that spake very great things, whose look was more stout than his fellows, I beheld, and the same horn made war with the saints, and prevailed against them, until the Ancient of Days came. And judgment was given to the saints of the Most High, and the time came that the saints possessed the kingdom. Thus he said, the fourth beast shall be the fourth kingdom upon the earth, which shall be diverse from all kingdoms, and shall devour the whole earth, and shall tread it down and break it in pieces. And the 10 horns out of this kingdom are 10 kings that shall arise, and another shall rise after them, and he shall be diverse from the first, and he shall subdue 3 kings. And he shall speak great words against the Most High, and shall wear out the saints of the Most High, and think to change times and laws, and they shall be given into his hand until a times, and dividing of time. But the judgment shall sit, and they shall take away his dominion, to consume and to destroy it unto the end. And the kingdom and dominion and the greatness of the kingdom under the whole heaven shall be given to the people of the saints of the Most High, whose kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and all dominions shall serve and obey him. All right, so we read bits and pieces of that, but I wanted to read that in one section. So let's talk about this little horn. And again, this is just very high level and not in-depth at all. We know that this is a ruler now that rises up in the final stage of the fourth kingdom, the Roman kingdom. He comes from within the revived Roman Empire. God refers to him in different ways in the Bible, particularly the New Testament. In 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, he's referred to as the man of sin. Same verse, he's referred to as the son of perdition, which gives you great cross-reference to Judas Iscariot, right? Be good to cross-reference that. He is also called specifically the Antichrist in 1 John in chapter 2. And then, of course, we know from John's vision in Revelation 13, he's referred to as the beast. Those are not the only titles given to him. He's called wicked by title, by name, capital W, that wicked shall be revealed. Other things, he's given titles in the Bible. Many years ago, I was friends with an occultist who had gotten saved. He was a high priest in the Church of Satan in San Francisco for many years, and was quite heavily involved in Wicca and Mormonism and Freemasonry. Anyway, in having conversations with him about the occult and the understanding that the occultists have of the Antichrist, they're very well aware that he's coming, and they're looking forward to him coming. But they used to reference him by a title. They still do, but the man that is smooth between the legs. And the inference there is, of course, going back to some things that the Bible says about the Antichrist, that he'll have no regard. He will not regard the desire of women. And even the occultists know that that's true about him in his coming. So there's a whole lot in the Bible about the Antichrist. It's quite a fascinating study if you've been into it. But we know that during the tribulation, these 10 kings will give their kingdom to the Antichrist. That's in Revelation 17:12. They're going to give their kingdom to him, and he will rise up at that time, and he will demand the worship of mankind. Daniel 11 talks about that. Of course, the Lord talked about that in the abomination of desolation. And I think we saw earlier in another session in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 about that as well. So he will demand the worship of mankind. And of course, at that point, the Jews are to flee and run to the hills. Don't go back home. You're going to die. And that's what takes place at the center point of the tribulation. All right? So this is the little horn. Again, very high level. We missed more than we got on that. But just some things so you know the reference to what this is. He's going to be overthrown one day. Okay? And of course, you and I are going to be in heaven during his rule if you're saved. But let's just read Revelation 19. I've got it on the screen here. John says, "And I saw the beast, and the kings of the earth and their armies gathered together to make war against him that sat on the horse and against his army. And the beast was taken, and with him the false prophet that wrought miracles before him, with which he had deceived them that had received the mark of the beast and them that worshipped his image. These both were cast alive into a lake of fire burning with brimstone." All right, so let's just say something. More certain than the air you're breathing into your lungs right now, this is going to happen in the future. And if you're saved, you're going to be here to watch this take place. You're coming back in Revelation 19 as the armies of heaven with the Lord Jesus Christ at his second advent if you're saved. And you're going to watch this take place. Okay, this is a wonderful thing. This is something to rejoice about. That the one that has deceived the whole world, speaking of Satan, and then of course he is the incarnation of Satan, the Antichrist, is going to be cast into the lake of fire, and it's over. I don't know about you, but I find that to be a wonderful thing, right? So that's the little horn that Daniel sees. Now, obviously, we know when you get to the end of the book of Daniel, we don't have to look at it now, but Daniel asked, when is this going to happen? How am I going to know that this is going to happen? And the angel said, "Now seal it up, Daniel. You don't get to know." Now, the key to that is the book of Revelation that unlocks it. And we have the privilege of knowing the when. And we get to see all of that. So let's just give a summary here as we finish off what's going to take place. A summary of the times of the Gentiles. All right, it starts here, as we know. It starts with the overthrow of Babylon. We talked about this at the very beginning in about 606. It concludes when Jesus Christ gets back to set up his earthly kingdom over the nations during that 1,000-year reign where Israel again becomes the head of the nations. I tried to include a picture here that had a river coming out from underneath of the temple because that's what's going to take place. But, you can only do so much with AI, but there it is. So that's what's going to take place there, where Israel now becomes the head and no longer the tail. This whole period of time is covered in the book of Daniel, the times of the Gentiles, and it describes those years where Jerusalem shall be trodden down of the Gentiles. So the Lord was just making reference to that in Luke 21 about the fact that Titus is coming. He's going to destroy the city of Jerusalem, and that Israel will be scattered among the nations until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled, which is still future to us. But I mean, when we look at the signs of the times, it seems like it's not far away, right? So let me give you one concluding thought to this. One concluding thought. The disciples said to the Lord, "Wilt thou at this time restore the kingdom to Israel?" Remember in Acts chapter 1? All right, Lord, well, here you are, and you died. We didn't see that coming. You rose from the dead. We didn't see that coming. So here you are, sitting yourself up as king. So, Lord, is it now? I mean, here they are on a hill outside of the city. Are you going to bring in the kingdom right now? And Jesus said here, it's not for you to know the times or the seasons which the Father has put in his own power. Now, what did he say right after this? I didn't put it on here on purpose. But ye shall receive power after that the Holy Ghost has come upon you. And back to what Vince has been drilling into us last night and today. And ye shall be witnesses unto me. And we've got to understand that when we study prophecy and an understanding of future events, that the times and the seasons are still under the power of God. And we can look at this, but there's so much in the Bible that still has shadows about it. God didn't specifically say a number of different things. Why is that? Well, I don't know all of those reasons, but I think probably one of them is this, that we understand what prophecy is so we can see the plan of God throughout the ages. That's a wonderful thing. But we have a job to do. Each one of us as believers, we have a job to do. And our job is to evangelize this world. That is our function as believers, right? We are to bear fruit for the Lord Jesus Christ. We are to preach the gospel to the lost. And we can't get so caught up in an understanding of prophetic events that we fail to be useful to the Lord Jesus Christ here. And I just want to use that as a word of caution and a challenge to all of us to utilize the opportunities we have every day to share the truth of Jesus Christ. The world doesn't know there's a judgment coming. And maybe for some of us, we go like Jonah did to Nineveh and cry against the city. Yet 40 days and Nineveh shall be overthrown. Maybe for some of us, we just have that calling from the Lord to cry against the city. But for others, it's just an opportunity every single day, as we heard this morning from Brother Steve in our prayer time. Just little opportunities here and there. There was an old evangelist back in the day. I think his name was Oliver B. Green. Have you ever heard of him? And he used to pray every day, Lord, lead me to the soul that's nearest to hell. Just looking for an opportunity to find somebody that was closest to eternity to share the gospel with them. So I just want to challenge all of us as we kind of round out this study to rejoice in the fact that we've been delivered from the wrath to come, to understand God's plan in this, but also to be motivated to share Christ with the lost.